Hi, good evening. It's Saturday evening, February 4th, and this evening I'm going to talk about the concept of symbolic interaction, and I'm also going to relate it to marketing and to some of the themes in our first chapter of the textbook. So, symbolic interaction is a concept that comes out of social psychology. So, for those of you who've studied psychology or studied sociology, you may have come across this concept. And it's basically a way of understanding the world, of making sense of things that are happening around us. So think about it for a moment because I think a lot of times we take it for granted. But each one of us, we have certain goals, we have certain values, we have a history, we have certain attitudes, and all of those things are unknown to other people. They're sort of internal, they're in our mind, they're in our being, but people don't know them or don't know about them. They don't know about what we really want or desire or what we want to achieve unless we explain it to them through communication. And this is a problem or a dilemma that people have had not only today, but 5,000 years ago, and they have it in every country in the world, and they'll have it in the future. No matter how complex societies become, fundamentally, you have the issue that you have certain things that you want and would like to achieve, but other people also have their own particular orientations. And in order to reach these goals, we have to communicate. We have to be able to take the role of the other person. So let's say, for example, you're in a situation where you live next door to somebody who has a loud dog that's barking all the time. And let's say that woman, she has a poodle, she paints the toenails of this poodle, she dresses it. You know, she loves that. That's her life. That's her main focus in life, that poodle. But that poodle wakes up at 6 in the morning on Saturday and wakes you up. Now, in order to go over there and present your case to the woman, you're going to have to think that you're going to have to take her role to be effective in communication, just like a lawyer, right, who makes his or her case in front of a jury. They have to they have to think very carefully, how are people going to receive this evidence or this argument? So you have to present it. If you don't want to start, your dog is obnoxious and you don't want to intimidate her, you don't want to anger her. So you want to create a situation that, you're a student, you're staying up late at night studying, and on Saturday mornings you really need to sleep, and you wonder if there's some way that maybe the dog on Saturday morning could be in a room that's not so close to your window so that you could sleep a little later. And you don't want to, again, make the person feel that you're criticizing the dog or you're saying something nasty, because then they can react in a way that might be hostile. And so you're taking the role and you're realizing that this is how she sees her dog. I don't see it that way, but she does, and therefore I've got to approach it delicately. So every day we have hundreds and thousands of situations like this, even reading the newspaper. We have to interpret, what does it mean in context of so many other things that are happening around us, or we're listening to television, or we're reading a novel. Whatever it is that we're doing requires taking the role of the other, requires some kind of assessment and evaluation of the symbols that are being presented. So, for example, people in their everyday communication, right, with each other, they use words, and words have particular meanings. But again, the symbolic interactionist perspective says that they have meaning in relation to the context in which they're happening. So that the same words, the same conversation can mean something very different in a different context. So we have a situation where we're using these words, where we're using other kinds of symbols, for example, gestures. So when somebody's talking to you and you're not interested, right, you might not be making eye contact, you might be texting, you might be doing something to indicate to them, even unconsciously not realizing that you have a low level of interest in what that person is saying, right? If you're teaching in front of a class, you'll see that very quickly, that a lot of people will be, doing something else that's not related. Maybe it's vaguely, it looks like they're taking notes, but they're really chatting with friends or on Facebook. So this is something that is communicated, and people may not always realize that these symbols are getting picked up. Also, what people wear, right? The clothing. Think about, sometimes it's very intentional, sometimes it's not as intentional. So that, like, you go to meet somebody, you go to a friend's party, and let's say you don't dress very, in a special way. Maybe you didn't really think about it, or you didn't really work through that very well. But when you go to the party, your friend takes it as an indication that you didn't think her party was very significant or important, that you just wore jeans, or you didn't like bother to really wear something more special. So when we go on a job interview, and sometimes we're much more conscious. We realize that we have to look a certain way. We take the role of the other person. We think, how is the person going to see me? So I have to kind of present myself in a way that will be acceptable to that person. So this is what symbolic interaction is all about. The idea that that's what people are accomplishing or doing. That's the work that's taking place, or the effort that's taking place in every communication. So Irving Goffman, who's a sociologist who talks about symbolic interaction, talks about or uses the metaphor of theater. And he says, we are all like actors on a stage. So when people, again, with their own particular goals and orientations, people use all kinds of props, right? They wear certain kinds of costumes in the theater. So if you're imagine if you're putting on a play, or you're writing a novel, and you want to convey to the readers that this is a bad person. So you're going to use certain kinds of clothing, you're going to use certain type of lighting, or you'll use certain types of vocabulary, so that person can come across as being dishonest, or being dangerous, or being somehow deviant. And so this in the theater is something that is choreographed very, very directly. And so in everyday life, people want to appear to be honest, want to appear not to be materialistic. They're going to present themselves in a way that's going to put forward that kind of orientation, so that the other person perceives them in a certain way, right? So sometimes people are dishonest, and that's something that creates conflicts too in interactions, because not people are not always using the symbols that exactly reveal what their intentions are. Sometimes they do just the reverse, right? For example, you might have a person who wants to be your friend, and it's not because they really like you or they really care about you, but it's because your father owns a business, and they want, hopefully, to get close to you so they can get a job in the business, right? Or they want to know your friends because your friends are interesting, but they don't really know you or care about you, but they're just using you as a means to do something else. So there's always that possibility of people being deceptive, of people being dishonest in communication. So the idea of taking the role of the other, interpreting the symbols, is important. And another thing that's important, or another kind of theme of symbolic interaction, is that meaning is not fixed and it's not inherent. It has to be arrived at, or it becomes relevant in interactional situations. So there's no meaning in and of itself apart from interaction. So think about this situation. Think about a person, and you'll see very quickly how everyday communication and interaction, and how dynamic interaction is, because it's changing it all at every moment. And that's another problem that we have in the world, that things are not constant, things are not fixed. And we would like them to be, of course, in some ways. When we find a situation that we're comfortable in, we want it to remain the same, but it's not going to remain the same, because life is dynamic and people are changing and new variables are always being introduced into every situation. So think about this situation. A man is going to propose marriage to a woman at a restaurant, as happens sometimes. And a friend of mine told me a story that was working in a restaurant, and this is probably something that happens all the time, or has happened, perhaps at least it happened to him. And what happened was, a man came into that restaurant intending ahead of time, came in a couple of hours early, brings the engagement ring, wants the engagement ring to be put in a, chocolate, on top of a piece of chocolate cake or something of that nature, and then brought to the table at the right moment, and so he could be making this proposal, and it can be very dramatic. Okay, so what happens is, the man goes to the restaurant with the woman, and he starts, before he makes the proposal, of course, he's going to start some preliminary conversation. And we could just imagine, I'm just making this part up, but we can imagine that what happened is that he said something about how happy he's been, how wonderful this relationship has been for him. And then maybe what happened is she said, well, it's been okay, but it's been problematic too, or it's not always been very good for me. And so let's say she indicates that she doesn't share his particular reality or his feelings or his view of the future. So it starts to become clear to him through that interaction. And perhaps yesterday it wasn't clear because they had a similar conversation and everything was fine. But today she's reevaluating, and or she's being more honest, or she's being more direct. And so now, what the friend told me in the restaurant is that he was being signaled by the man, don't bring it out because something's gone wrong. And they understood that don't bring out the engagement ring. The situation has deteriorated, let's say. And so in an interaction, that's how meaning gets established. So the man had in his mind the proposal, the picture. He had this kind of movie in his mind of what would happen, but in the actual interaction, the reality totally changed and moved in a different direction. Okay, so that's something that can always happen in situations. We can be in that job interview, we can be very confident, we can be very nervous, and then all of a sudden something happens. The person says to us, well, I think you're really ideal for this position. And now all of a sudden all that tension, all that doubt is disappearing, because now you know that you're just about to be hired. And so now you can relax. Now the interaction changes. So the interaction is based on that moment, that situation, and is dynamic and changing, never fixed. So we like to think the world is predictable. We like to think that, now let's bring it a little bit into the world of marketing. We like to think that people are going to respond to a certain kind of commercial in a certain way, or to a new product line that we want to develop in a certain way. But people have their own agenda, they have their own kind of reality, and there are new things happening all the time that can be changing their orientation. So the way they felt yesterday may not be the way they feel tomorrow, based on the political climate, based on the economy. All kinds of things from the outside are always happening and changing. So the world is dynamic, it's unpredictable, and the viewpoint of symbolic interaction is that everything is determined moment to moment through the interactional situation, right? So you are, for example, you're working at a company, you are the star, you're the person that the boss calls, that the boss relies on, praises. You're like the person that's the rising star, let's say, in the company. And that's been happening for 3 weeks, or for 3 years, or for 30 years, let's say. And then all of a sudden, it can change. The next day, you can come to work and something you said, something you did, something you wore, it's hard. Sometimes we never know why things change. Now all of a sudden, the person has a different attitude toward you. You offended them, somebody else impressed them more, and now you've lost your status, you've lost your position. They're not interacting you with they're not interacting with you in the same way anymore. So this is the dynamic nature, and this shows that every single thing, according to the symbolic interactionist point of view, happens and is determined and is decided upon within interaction. So I think I'm going to stop right now, and I'm going to continue, because I'm afraid I'm going over time. I'm going to continue with another video which will look a little bit at the chapter 1, and which will connect some of the symbolic interaction to chapter 1, and I'll also talk a little bit about the quiz as well. So I will return.